Hi everyone, and welcome to Deep Geek Live. Today we are talking about the Lord of the Rings. But first of all, as we always do, we will go through a few little bits of news going on in the slightly wider world, other things that I've been covering. First of all, just today, I think, we've had another update from George R. R. Martin on where he is in terms of the Winds of Winter. I don't know where this show is. This was a thing called Tuning Out, which I'm not aware of. I don't think it's made its way across my side of the Atlantic. And basically, it was a cartoon character interviewing George R. R. Martin, and brought in James Patterson, this other excellent prolific writer, and they had a little bit of fun talking about how not prolific George R. R. Martin is. And as part of that, he let slip that he was about 1,100 or 1,200 pages in, he said, and has 400 or 500 pages to go. Now, I don't know the show, whatever that is. I don't know quite how seriously George R. R. Martin was taking that moment, but that sort of fits in with what he's been saying recently. He said that he's 75% of the way through it, which that roughly is, and that kind of maps out to the kind of length we were expecting for it as well. So it's sort of a non-update update, really. On the Rings of Power, we have a lot of new casting information. I talked a little bit about particularly the news about Joseph Maul, but we've now had 7 more new recurring characters, or actors, I should say, confirmed for the show. This is in addition to the 7 or 8 new characters that they announced last week. I don't think we've got enough information to say who these are. These aren't the main characters that we might be expecting, like Círdan. They've already announced perhaps Celeborn coming, that kind of thing. These will be recurring characters who are perhaps not as significant. But a couple of things to note. The first, I think this means that we will have a significant new plot line, given the amount of new characters. I assume this is in Rhûn, where the Stranger and Nori are heading off, so they will need to have a few new characters there. But also, just adding up these characters, they already started with quite 20-something main characters. They've added it. They only lost, I think, 1 main character in season 1. So now we're adding in another 7 plus another 7 recurring characters. This is quite an epic cast list for season 2. So I think that's basically all we can talk about on that one. Witcher Blood Origin, there is, I think this has been out since last week, a new trailer, and quite a lot of publicity. They've been doing some good publicity rounds on this. And I will admit, I've been quite uncertain about Witcher Blood Origin. For those who don't know, this is a spin-off mini-series set a long time before The Witcher, talking about some of the things that we hear about happening in the distant past, like the conjunction of the spheres, things like that. They will explain these things. But this has had a troubled production, it's fair to say. This is not the first trailer we've had for this. In fact, the first trailer we had for this was, by my count, over a year ago. It's been that long coming to us. Now, this, as I say, is the first time I've really started getting quite excited by this. The new trailer I saw, it came out a while ago. I will retweet it after this if you're interested in seeing it. But it does show the story that they're trying to tell, which was something that I hadn't previously managed to glean from what we've been getting from them. So yeah, I'm quite excited. It's going to be not what they initially filmed. That much I think is reasonably clear. But I'm now hoping that this might be a good and worthy addition to the TV canon for The Witcher. And one other final thing before we move on to the main business today. Caius Ballerina, you did a super chat last week. There's often one that I just have mind blanks on. You asked about Aegon's crown missing its rubies. This is a costuming question, really, as much as anything else, as far as I can tell. when on House of the Dragon we saw what we're told was Aegon the Conqueror's crown placed on Aegon II's head, it had a big shiny ruby in the front. However, Aegon the Conqueror's crown, which we read about in the books, and also there's some excellent artwork, that had rubies, plural, big square rubies, we're told. Now, why? Where did those rubies go? I think this is just a costume issue. I think this is the design thing. It's probably easier to make just the one ruby in the front look really cool rather than lots going around the outside. I don't know. But that's the issue. It was just that it looked cool when they created the costumes. So let's get into some questions. As always, my questions, I'm going to frame this around questions from my patrons. I will try and pick up as much as I can in the chat as we are going through. But let's start off with one from Matthew Hawkins saying, when Gandalf threw the One Ring into the glowing embers of the fire in Bag End, would Sauron or the Nazgul have perceived anything happening to the ring? Which is a really interesting question, because the moment when he throws in there and he pulls it out and he's heated it up, and so he can then see the fiery inscription on the ring. Would Sauron or the Nazgul sense anything? Well, the first answer, I think there's 3 levels to this. The simple answer, I think, is probably no. The slightly more complex answer is Tolkien didn't give us all of the details of the relationship between, or the connection between, the One Ring and Sauron and the wearers of the other rings, but it's not quite as strong a connection as it's sometimes portrayed, particularly in the Peter Jackson movies, which leads to the slightly longer version of the answer, because this gives me a good excuse, I think, to lay out a few of what we do know about the sensing of the ring by Sauron and by the Nazgul. Now, we instinctively think when someone puts the ring on, Sauron can sense it. Now, that's not 100% right. At least he can't immediately get a connection with that person. Perhaps he senses somewhere out there somebody has put the ring on, but Gollum put it on loads, Bilbo put it on loads, even most of the times that Frodo puts it on in the books, he doesn't get this connection with Sauron. When Sam puts it on, he's there just outside the border, literally a few yards outside the border of Mordor, and he's there thinking, if I go into Mordor wearing the ring, then Sauron will obviously find me quite quickly. But he seems to think that there's an issue with if he's staying outside Mordor, then he doesn't think that Sauron did not sense that there was somebody literally just outside Mordor putting the ring on. So the link is not quite as strong as we might think. Up close, yes. And this is where the Nazgul come in, because the Nazgul they are wraiths. They are in the spiritual realm. For Tolkien, there was the corporeal realm, the world that we live in, and then sort of super inlaid upon the top of that is this spiritual realm, and that's where the ring wraiths existed in. Now, when you put on the One Ring, you enter into that realm, and therefore they can see you. But that doesn't, they have to actually be close enough to see you. There did seem to be a sort of a faint, they could sense where the ring was, but they had to be close enough to be knowing exactly where it was. When in the Shire, the Nazgul is on the road and the hobbits are hiding from the Nazgul and they're sniffing, that's because the Nazgul is in this other realm, and it's actually relying not on its eyesight, it's relying on the sight of its horse. but it's sniffing. That's what's going on there. So the link is not quite as strong. For those who are wondering about, but surely there was times when Sauron could sense. Yeah, there were a couple of times when Sauron could sense Frodo putting it on very specifically. One of them was on Emyn Muil, which is the place where, if you remember the breaking of the Fellowship, Boromir tries to get the ring from Frodo. Frodo puts it on. He goes up to this big stone seat, and there he's wearing the ring, and there suddenly Sauron is looking for him, at which point he hears this voice, which is Gandalf, almost certainly saying, take off the ring, you fool. And it's Gandalf could sense that Sauron was looking for Frodo and could see that this was there because this is a magical point, a seeing place. And so it was therefore possible to be seen. The other time, obviously, is right at the very, very end when we have Frodo putting on the ring there in Mount Doom. And that being right in Sauron's backyard, yes, he knows exactly what's going on there. So the link is not quite as strong as we think, which is why Sauron's sending out his Nazgul to go and hunt for the ring. If he knew exactly where it was, then obviously he'd go and get it. When Gollum had it in the Misty Mountains, it wasn't that far from where Sauron was based, recovering in the south of Mirkwood. Similarly, Bilbo uses it in the north of Mirkwood, while Sauron is in the south of Mirkwood. In that instance, perhaps he was slightly distracted by the fact that the entire White Council was attacking him, so maybe he didn't notice. But the point remains, Bilbo used it on several occasions, Frodo used it, Gollum used it, and Sauron did not know where it was. So the link is not quite as strong as we sometimes think it might be. And that extends when you're saying whether would they have known it being, would Sauron have known when it went into the fire? Well, again, we're not told. So the instinctively no. The only thing which makes me go, well, maybe, is that what happened when it went into the fire was it effectively ignited the ringverse, which Sauron had used. That was basically the spell binding the one ring to these other rings, or the other rings to the one ring, and that ringverse was created on the one ring at the point of its creation. So it's possible that there was some magic that was going on there that did kind of alert Sauron, but it wasn't strong enough for him to go, right, now I know where I need to go. He sent out the riders not knowing where they had to go. So this all brings me around to the probably no is the short answer to that one, but it's quite an interesting topic to get into. Question from pardon me. I had a bit of a cold this week, by the way, I should just say, so apologies if I suddenly break down into a coughing fit. I will try and mute if I do. Martin S. saying, hi, Robert, I love your channel. Thank you very much. I'm almost certain Aragorn is the greatest living man in Lord of the Rings time in terms of abilities, experience, and overall personal power. Who would be second? The Mouth of Sauron question. Well, I mean, this is an interesting. At the time of the Lord of the Rings, Mouth of Sauron, we're not told exactly who or what Mouth of Sauron is. Maybe one day I'll do a video on that. But I think perhaps my rather left field answer to this would be Denethor. Now, we see Denethor at the end of his very long struggle with Sauron, but it's very clear Denethor had access to one of the Palantiri, and we're told that in order to be able to use this, you have to have you have to have an incredibly strong mind, and he did. He could control it. He could use it for huge amounts of time, and when he's described, I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but he's described as being like a king, like a Númenórean king. He is great in his own way. Obviously, by the time we see him, then he's descended down into quite a dark place, but naturally gifted and powerful. I think I would probably hold him up as being the next greatest. Let's go to a question from Alan Simpson saying, "Hi, Robert. Missed the last couple because I was in hospital for surgery." Oh, well, I'm sorry to hear that. I hope you're much better now. Saying, "Good to be back live again. Have you read The Lord of the Rings first edition? Any comments to make on the changes between it and the second?" No, actually, and this is... I've got a sort of a question related to this later, but what I'll say is this is something I'm going to be doing a video on in the next few weeks, to the changes that Tolkien made to his stories, because I find this an absolutely fascinating subject, because he was, and we'll come on to this in a moment, he was a perfectionist, but that means that he looked back at things that he'd done and he updated them and shifted them and changed them. So what I will do is I will beg your indulgence on that specific point and promise you that actually this will be part of a video where I will go into in more depth, but I've not as yet looked at those different. At the moment, what I'm doing is looking more at the Hobbit changes, which are quite significant. But yes, thank you. That's a really good question. Mark Sheeser is saying one of the reasons I dislike Denethor is that he looked down on Theoden for leading his army from the front. Yeah, absolutely. So I'm not saying Denethor is a great human in any way, shape, or form in terms of powerful. Then I think that he probably has the greater power, which incidentally he did pass on in different ways to his two sons, Boromir and Faramir. Faramir is an astonishing character in the books. They watered him down quite a lot in the movies, but he's a great character in the books. And Boromir himself, although we often think of him as being the weak one, the one who gave in to the power of the ring, he's quite a legend. He is rightly held up as a hero down in Gondor. He was holding back a huge amount of the forces of Sauron for quite a long period of time. Question from one of my patrons, Martin Sierstrand. Really interesting one, saying, "Hello, Robert. I have something I've been considering for years about Gandalf. Is he asexual? Okay, he probably is, as he is essentially a kind of angel clad in a form reminiscent of an elderly human male. A better question might therefore be whether he is disinterested even in having a spouse, the way the majority of the Valar did. I would say that it's possible that Gandalf simply has a greater mission or calling, if you will, and would find a romance to be a distraction. I don't know. Maybe there is a Maya lady for Alorin back in Valinor who we've just not heard about, but there's nothing to back him up, to back that up. What is your take on Alorin Gandalf when it comes to the matter of a life partner?" Yes, so this is a really interesting question, because, I mean, the fundamental answer is that we do not have anything on this. We have no indication that Gandalf as a character, or Alorin, that's his name, back as a member of the Maya, as a Maya, he's an eternal spiritual being, and back in the Undying Lands, he was known as Alorin. There's never anything that we read that suggests that he either had or was interested in any way in having romantic sexual relationship at all. So the straightforward answer is that, as far as we can tell, yes, that is the case. This isn't the case just because he is a Maya, is the next level to this, because we do have two things. First of all, as you've said, the Maya are just a sort of a lesser or less powerful version of the Valar, and the Valar did definitely, quite a few of them, couple up. So it's not a matter of this, just is the nature of him is not to have any of those feelings. But we also have the example of a Maya, Melian the Maya, who did fall in love and have a family. So it is possible. It is very possible for a Maya to fall in love. Gandalf did not. Now, we can certainly say in Tolkien's the way Tolkien wrote, I think everybody would recognize, is with a very clear sort of personal view of how he wished to do this subcreation. He was a man of the world. He understood that it wasn't this straightforward. But in terms of his characters, most of them, almost all of them, were either married for life or celibate. There was not much by way of in between. So that of the two, Gandalf is more in the sort of the celibate area. Now, I think it's quite interesting how you talked about him with his taking on the form of an old man, because this, I think, is probably the heart of the answer here, which is that he, when the Astari went to Middle Earth, they took on the forms of old men, with the frailty, the physical frailties that brought with it. So this was to keep them humble, but also to make sure that they were not leading the children of Iluvatar. They were there to support and help. So he was there as an old man. Now, that means that he could be wearied. And he was wearied on many occasions, even though he had the Ring of Power, which helped him out hugely by that. But he also had this mission. And his mission did mean that he was just focused on that. And we're told specifically that he was the one of the five Astari who never lost focus on his mission. Now, that is not to say that this would be a bad thing in a conceptual way in Tolkien's world for him to sort of meet someone and fall in love, but it does mean that, to take Radagast, for example, Radagast lost sight of his mission for actually quite good reasons. He seemed to just fall in love with nature and the world and want to spend his time with that. And that's actually a nice and good and upright thing. So I don't think that Tolkien viewed this as a sort of a right or wrong. It's just that's who Gandalf was, and that's what his character was. But pardon me. But for his character that he created, then yes, I think that he is presented, and I know a lot of people have taken heart in the fact that there are a lot of characters that Tolkien created who he presents as asexual and aromantic. So yes, I think he is, but I think that this is not a part because he was specifically because he was a Maya. I think it was because that was who he was. Let's go to a question from Michael Kelly, saying, what do you think of the Rings of Power theory that Halbrand was found by Sauron, who knocked him out and took his shape, meaning that the real Halbrand may show up later? So this is Rings of Power rather than Lord of the Rings Tolkien world. So this is something in the show world. The idea that he might have been knocked out and the real Halbrand might have been knocked out and Sauron took his form, possibly. I think that the way that they presented that was that he says he took the sigil thing off of a dead man, and I think the implication was that the dead man may well have been Halbrand. So that was where they were going with it. Might we meet the real Halbrand at some point? Possibly, but the real Halbrand, who is that? Does that actually make a difference to the plot? I suspect not. What I think is more interesting for me at the moment is what they're going to be doing in the show about the rings, and how are they going to bring Halbrand back to forge the rings with Celebrimbor? Is he going to shapeshift into Anatar, which we were expecting in season 1, but is he going to take on a new form and be Anatar and come back and get in that way? I think it's a bit of a mystery. For me, Halbrand as a character seemed the Sauron / Halbrand as a character seemed callous enough to have killed Halbrand if he wished to take his identity. He happily cut half of that boat off, letting people die. He happily was pummeling people to near death in Numenor. He clearly was very happy to be causing a huge amount of damage to people. So I don't see why he would leave him alive. Let's have a quick flick through the chat. Lucia Piver saying, I enjoy Rings of Power. I think it might deviate a bit, but it's a good show and I'm eager for the new season. LS saying, having a child or a romantic attachment in the temporal world or Middle Earth would completely undermine the spiritual dynamic which Gandalf was predestined to perform. Yep, I think that's a really good point there. Brothers Crin saying, do take care of yourself. You don't feel well enough. Cut the stream a little shorter than usual. Well, thank you very much. I do. That means a lot. Yes, I will. Do not worry. I was off a bit earlier in the week, but I'm feeling a lot better now. I've just got a tickly cough lingering. George Cochrane saying, I hope this question hasn't been asked too many times before, but I'm curious to know if the Rings of Power series is widely considered canon. I mean, I think the answer is, in terms of Tolkien, no. This is they're not telling Tolkien's story. They're writing a story within Tolkien's world, which I think is quite a significant difference. I don't think that doesn't mean that the show is in and of itself going to be bad. As I say, I enjoyed it, and I've said I enjoyed it for ever since it's been on. But this is not Tolkien's story, and I think we should just be reasonably clear about that. There was the potential. I was holding out hope, perhaps, that even up to the last episode, that one thing the showrunners had been, I thought, quite clear on was that what they called the tent poles of the story of the Second Age, the forging of the rings, the rise and fall of Numenor, the last alliance of elves and men, things like that. They saw them as being the tent poles of the story, and then they would sort of try and weave into the gaps. They shifted enough, I think, now on the forging of the rings that I think we now accept that this is not the way that Tolkien wrote the story. I reiterate, that does not mean it's going to be a bad show. I enjoyed the show, but Tolkien canon, no. The way I like to see this is George R.R. Martin has been very clear quite recently about how he views the TV shows in his world. And he's basically said there are two canons. There are two canons. There's his books canon, and then there's the show canon. And he's okay with that. He is absolutely fine with the idea that there are two different types of canon. There's two different stories. They are they're linked, they're similar. He wants them to be as close as possible to each other, but he sees them as being two different sets of canon. And I think that is how we should be seeing the Rings of Power, is that this is show canon as opposed to Tolkien's writings canon. Let's have a quick flick through. Andrew Kay saying, the bit that vexes me is that the Rings of Power seems borrowing from the Third Age when there was already too much to cover in the Second Age. Yeah, they do seem to a little bit, and also cutting some things from the Second Age. Dan Edwards saying, I'm not sure the forging of the rings in the Rings of Power is that far from Tolkien. George R. R. J.R.R. Tolkien was quite vague about the actual mechanics of making the rings. Yes, he was vague about the mechanics, not the order, and he was not vague about the timescale, and he was not vague about who it was who seduced the elves into it, or the purpose of the rings, or of the creation, and therefore why they are like they are. Those kinds of things. So for me, they are significantly different. Let's go to a question from Mara Lee. Hi there, Mara. If you're watching back, I don't see you in the chat, but perhaps you're going to watch back later, saying, why didn't Gandalf realize that the ring that Bilbo found was the one ring that he and his fellow wizards had been sent to destroy? So this is firstly, just on a point of detail, Gandalf and the other Astari had not been sent specifically to destroy the One Ring. They'd been sent to assist and help the free peoples of Middle-earth against the darkness, basically. Sauron was starting to move again. When they were sent, Sauron was starting to move again, and so they were sent over to help and support the peoples of Middle-earth. They obviously knew about the One Ring, but the One Ring by this point had disappeared for a millennia, so it wasn't the main thing. Sauron had disappeared for a millennia, so the role that they had was trying to see what was going on rather than anything else. And it was only Saruman who started with this fixation on the ring and where the ring might be. Gandalf was concerned about it, but he was just roving all over the place looking for various different things. Why didn't Gandalf realize that this was the One Ring, though? Well, the mundane, real-world answer is that when Tolkien wrote The Hobbit, he had not yet conceptualized the plot of The Lord of the Rings, and so this was just a cool ring that Bilbo found. It was not the One Ring in Tolkien's mind when Tolkien was writing The Hobbit. Now, obviously, when he wrote The Lord of the Rings, he then went back and sort of tweaked The Hobbit a little bit. That's one of the things I'll be talking about in the video that I kind of teased a little bit earlier. There is a later version of The Hobbit where you get a shift in that chapter when Bilbo gets the ring in his meeting with Gollum. So, but the in-world answer to it is that Gandalf wasn't expecting the Ring of Power to be hidden somewhere in the depths of the Misty Mountains. Why would you? He was not expecting a hobbit from the Shire to end up with the One Ring. Why would you expect that? And it didn't look impressive. It was just a simple golden band. As far as he could tell, it was just a ring of invisibility. There was nothing there to be setting off any immediate red flags. So he thought it would appear initially this was probably one of the early rings that Anatar and the elves of Eregion forged, what Gandalf called mere essays in the craft. Before they forged the Rings of Power, because Anatar was there for 300 years. Before they forged the Rings of Power, they forged lots of other smaller magical rings, developing ring magic technology. And where they went, who knows? Gandalf could easily believe that some of these were out there in the wild. And he does give Bilbo a generic warning about it. He basically says, magical rings are not to be trifled with. You do not know all of the powers of this One Ring, because Gandalf didn't know all of the powers of this One Ring, because this single ring that was there, because he didn't know what it was, but he assumed it was one of these smaller rings. Now, because the One Ring itself had disappeared for a very long time, and so he didn't know exactly what the One Ring looked like. It was only later that his suspicions started to grow, when he could see quite how possessive of it Bilbo was getting, quite how long-lived Bilbo was. And then he started hunting down, trying to find out the story of it, and then it started to pick the bits of the story together and started creating this narrative so he could see how it could possibly get. Because still in his mind, how on earth could the One Ring end up there? And then slowly he could work his way through and find out how it was. And then the throwing the ring into the fire, which was which we talked about a little bit earlier, was basically his last test. He was pretty sure at that point, but he just wanted to see, because with the heat that should reveal the lettering. Paul Siegel saying, would you consider the Peter Jackson movie trilogy to be part of the Tolkien canon or the Rings of Power canon, or neither? Do you think it matters? Well, I mean, does it matter? Ultimately, no. Does it matter? I'm not the kind of person, as you've probably picked up, to be a bit of a gatekeeper about this. I think that Peter Jackson's movies, particularly the Lord of the Rings trilogy, I mean, the Hobbit trilogy was something else, but the Lord of the Rings trilogy itself, I think that was both as good as cinema gets, and also as good an adaptation of those books as you're going to get. By which I do not mean the most accurate. There are huge amounts of changes in that Peter Jackson and co. We call them the Peter Jackson films, but it wasn't just him. But there are huge amounts of changes that were made. But I can buy into them, because the end result was a film or set of films that feel like the original story. The story is told in a Tolkien-y way. The language is Tolkien-y. The story is the same story. They've cut out a few bits. They've changed the order of a few bits. They've tweaked a few characters, but it's the same overarching story. And so I hold that. I mean, it's not a great original or profound opinion, but I hold that in highest regard. That isn't, but it's not Tolkien, but it's Tolkien adjacent. I don't know. It's I find the need to categorize everything as good or bad to be not quite as nuanced as I want it to be. I am happy to say that Peter Jackson's movies have many flaws is in adaptation of Tolkien's work, but I think that they're amazing. So to say, are they Tolkien canon or not Tolkien canon, I think it's they're in their own piece of art, and I think we should judge it on its own merits. Reflective Rambling saying, I'm not positive, but I think he's a big Sam and Glorfindel fan. I don't know who you're replying to, somebody called Dusty Baker there. If you're asking who my favorite characters are, Sam is the best character. In my view, he's my favorite character. He's the person I would wish to be on my best day. Glorfindel, I do love Glorfindel as a character, and also because I find he's hard done by in adaptations. He was basically left out of the movies, and he should be there in the Second Age, and not seen him yet in the Rings of Power. So I just feel he's such an epically good character that I just feel he's a little bit hard done by. But my instinct with Tolkien, the characters that I love the most tend to be the supporting characters. Sam, I love Barleyman as a character. I think he's amazing. I love Farmer Maggot. A lot of the characters in that earlier a sort of part of the story. I think amazing. Tom Bombadil, obviously. So there are a lot of great characters there. So it's hard to pick one, but if I have to, it's Sam. Yeah. The Ents as well. Lucio Piper pointing out the Ents. Yes, can't go by without talking about Treebeard. And Alan Simpson in the chat saying, I'm pretty sure in Rings of Power they're going to replace Glorfindel with Celeborn as the returning elf character. Yeah, I did a video a bit about that. I can't even remember what I called it on the Rings of Power, but yes, I think that's a really good shout. Mark Sheesa saying Ecthelion is a way greater warrior than Glorfindel. Well, quite possibly. Ecthelion was there fighting alongside Glorfindel, and he killed, depending on which account of Tolkien's you go by, he killed 3 Balrogs. So he's pretty impressive. The thing I love about Glorfindel is his actions, not just in was he a great fighter, it's his actions when he returns to Middle Earth. He's so OP, and yet he just holds himself back and allows his mere presence to have an impact, which is I just find fascinating. Let's go to a question from the King's Road saying, G'day, Robert. G'day. I'd like to know if there is a standout passage in any of Tolkien's works that you are personally inspired by or take comfort in, like a description of a nature scene or a quote. Well, yeah, so I was thinking about this beforehand, so I pulled out a couple. The first 2, there's so much in Tolkien that I could talk about. 2 that I would share today, because every day it's slightly different, one of which you will already know, one of which perhaps you won't. The one that everybody loves, but it never fails to move me, is the rhyme about Aragorn. All that is gold does not glitter, not all those who wander are lost. The old that is strong does not wither, deep roots are not reached by the frost. And I think that's it's a wonderful little phrase, not just as here's Aragorn, but as inspiration for us as humans. This and how we view people. I think it's in the Bible, the phrase "all that glitters is not gold," and Tolkien kind of switched it around to "all that is gold does not glitter." And I actually prefer that the Tolkien version. The idea that not all beautiful and wonderful things are beautiful and wonderful on the outside. And not all those with great character, you can see it on the outside. It's in the roots, and that is incredibly meaningful. But another one in terms of sheer beauty, just another that you may want to look up afterwards. Faramir, towards the end of this, the story, Faramir declares his love for Éowyn, and he's very poetic in the way he says it, but then just this really simple, and this is what I think Tolkien did masterfully with language, is use incredibly simple language in an incredibly beautiful way. So Faramir says his thing, and we just read, "Then the heart of Éowyn changed, or at last she understood it, and suddenly her winter passed, and the sun shone on her." And I just think that is just so beautiful. It's just this idea of maybe it wasn't that her heart changed, but she now understands her heart, and why that's actually perhaps more important. Her winter passed and the sun shone on her is just such a wonderful visual imagery. Yeah, a couple. Thank you for that, Kings Road, for giving me the opportunity just to wax lyrical about Tolkien's writing for a while. It's something I hugely adore, and any chance to share it is there, I will take. Mara Lee, oh hi there, thank you so much. Very generous super chat. Thank you, Mara, saying just a show of love and support for all the incredible videos, merch, and the fabulous stories on the well-told tale. Hugs to Dan, your handsome dog. You are the best. Well, thank you so much, and also you just sent a super sticker. Thank you, I hugely appreciate that, and all of your support, Mara. Bruno Kavanahi. Saying you've answered a lot of my questions about Tolkien's work, and your way to explain is awesome. Thank you so much for your work. Hugs from Brazil. Well, thank you so much. I hugely appreciate that. Thank you. That's very kind, and a very generous super chat as well. Thank you so much. Just having a quick flick through the chat. Homebody saying book Aragorn is uptight and humorless. Vigo was more appealing. I never could figure out what Arwen saw in him. Honestly, that relationship is a plot device. Uptight and humorless. I mean, Viggo Mortensen did bring a humanity into the character. I would certainly say Tolkien used Aragorn. I mean, I think a plot device is not the way I would say that, but as very much a driver of the action and prophecy, and bringing a prophecy into it. And ALGX saying, I'm reading the books this now. Book Aragorn seems more like the Rough Ranger than does the movie version. Yeah, I think that's probably, as you say, he's not as warm. Martin S saying, thank you for a good answer to my patron question. I would guess, though, that the Astari were technically capable of fathering children, simply opting not to. The Nazgul, not so much, too undead. Yeah, well, so Melian the Maya did have a child. So there is Maya ancestry that actually continues all the way through to the story of the Lord of the Rings, because Elrond is a descendant of Melian the Maya. So he is, and this is part of what makes Elrond so special, is the fact that he actually is not just the half-elven, but he's also got this Maya ancestry to him as well. But in terms of the when you say the Nazgul are not so much capable of fathering children, no, they're ghosts basically. So no, they are. In fact, when Tolkien talks about how they were originally sent out, when Sauron sends them out at the start of the Lord of the Rings, he sends them out without the horse, without the clothing. They were just as ghosts, effectively heading out, invisible. They could not be seen at all. It's only afterwards that he thought, well, they need to be asking questions, or they thought they need to be asking questions, interacting with people. We should put big cloaks over them, give them horses to ride, things like that. So they were spiritual, or beings existing on the spiritual plane is probably the best way of saying that. So no, their days of being parents were long past. Dusty Baker saying, is there a particular set of books that you like the best, like a limited edition set or something? Of the Lord of the Rings. You know, I'm one of those people. I adore books, physical hard copied books, and I love the beautiful editions that are produced, but I don't have them here to hand. But the version of the Lord of the Rings I love the most is the one that I read, which sounds like the most obvious answer, but I've flicked through it so many times, read through it so many times, and it just feels, for me, that is the Lord of the Rings. And I can and have read it on Kindle and listened to it, and lots of different ways of imbibing the story, but just that hard copy in my hands, which is just big enough to be sort of holding properly as a book, that any bigger it would feel unmanageable for me. But yeah, that's the version that I love. Alan Simpson saying, isn't Aragorn also a descendant of Melian through Elros? Yes, indeed. So Elros, but a long way down the line. So you get Melian is the great-grandmother, if I'm getting this right, the great-grandmother of Elrond and Elros. Now, Elrond and Elros, twins, were given the choice: do you want to be living a life as an elf? Do you want to be living a life as a human? Elrond chose elf, Elros chose human. Elrond we know about. Elros went off to become the first king of Numenor. Numenor, new island kingdom created. Here you go. Good and faithful men, you can have an island kingdom. Elros was the first king of that, and he lived for a good 400 years. And then from his line, if you go down many, many generations, and then even after the fall of Numenor, many, many generations from Elendil, you do get to Aragorn. So yes, he has got some of that Maya ancestry, but it's depending on which way you count the family tree. I think it's either the 35th or 38th generation down from there. So quite a long way down. But yes, you're right. He does have some Maya ancestry. Okay, so let's go to another question from one of my patrons. This is Dioscur saying, "Hi Robert, we know that Tolkien changed things in his story over time. Do we know if he was happy with everything by the time it was published? Do we know if he regretted any of his decisions? Did he write or say what he would like to change? There is a question behind this. He seemed to me like some sort of a perfectionist, and while perfectionism can lead to excellent results, it can just as well stop you from ever finishing what you started because you never feel like it is ready. I'm amazed that he was ever able to decide it is done and publish it." So this, I said a little bit earlier that I had another question on this. So here it is. So this is, in terms of Tolkien's changes, yes, he did make some tweaks to it. One thing I would specifically highlight, I made a video a while ago, maybe a year ago, on the names of the three parts of the trilogy. What were the two towers in the two towers? Because this was a thing he specifically didn't like. He wrote this as one novel, and then had debates with the publishers, because the publishers said, well, this is a really big story, and this is supposed to be a sequel to this relatively short children's story you wrote all that time ago, and now you're giving this huge magnum opus, and by the way, you're also asking us to publish alongside it the Silmarillion, which is incredibly dense and of a completely different style. They negotiated for quite some time, and they got to a point where they reached an agreement it would be published, but in three parts. He would split this story up into three parts, and obviously they then needed names for these three parts. He was okay with the Fellowship of the Ring, that was fine, but the other two names he actually regretted over time. The Return of the King he found quite spoilery. He didn't use that word. That's not a very Tolkien word, but that was the feeling. He felt that it gave away a bit too much of the plot and what was about to happen. The Two Towers, he kind of liked, but he changed his mind a lot on which two towers these might be. And he started off being quite clear on what it was, and then he went to the well, actually, if you look at the action, maybe it was these other things, or maybe we should just, it's up to the reader to be deciding what the two towers are. So he never quite came to terms with that. And it is a bit of an odd, if you write an entire novel as is, without thinking I'm going to break it down into three parts, the start kind of makes sense, the end kind of makes sense, but the middle is just the chunk in the middle. So that was always slightly awkward. But in terms of the sort of the bigger issue you got there about perfectionism. I did want to touch on this because it's worth, I think, just unpacking a little bit about this. We talk about his perfectionism, and it is undeniably true. He was a perfectionist. And what this meant was that he was always changing things in his world as he went through his life. He didn't see this as a problem. He shifted things. He changed the nature of Balrogs, the nature of orcs, the history of Galadriel again and again and again. As he was going through his life, he would change things here and there. Now, how The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings got published is basically he had to be pushed by people at various points. C.S. Lewis was quite important in this, as were a few other people, pushing him to complete something and then send it off. And so, yes, it's a bit of a miracle we got 2 books out of him at all. But he does write about the writing process, the perfectionism in him, in a story, a wonderful little short story called Leaf by Niggle, which, if you've never come across it, you'll find it in a number of different sort of collections of Tolkien works. Tales from the Perilous Realm is in there, if you ever come across that. And it's not an allegory. He doesn't like allegory. It's definitely more than just what I'm saying. I'm going to talk about in a moment. There's a spiritual element to this as well. He was a very strong Catholic, but he did admit that a lot of his approach to writing was reflected in this story. And it's the story of this character called Niggle, who was an artist. He was an artist in a world that didn't really care about art. And he started painting this forest, and with a particular tree. And he spent ages just going over teeny details of it, leaf by leaf by leaf. And he was never finishing it because he was always getting interrupted by people. He had a neighbor he was a goodly sort leaf. He had a neighbor who he had a lot of problems, and he kept on going around and helping out the neighbor. And then he had work to do, and he had this and he had that, and he kept on getting distracted. And he knew eventually he had to go off on a journey, and he went off on a journey, and he left the painting, and it was unfinished. And there's a whole extra layer to where this goes, which is where the sort of the more spiritual element to this is. But the painting itself eventually gets cut up because people don't value art in that place, except for one leaf which gets preserved and ends up in a museum. And this is, as I say, it's a beautiful little short story. And Tolkien did admit that this was a bit like how he viewed his writing process, was that he was so obsessed by these details that he would never finish it. He would never actually finish. He might finish a leaf here or there. He might finish a tree, but he would never manage to paint the entire forest. And what we have here with The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings effectively are 2 of the leaves that Tolkien was painting, because his life's work was what we think of as the Silmarillion. It was the creation of this world, the mythology, the languages, the history, the characters that inhabit it. The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit are just these offshoots that come off from it at the end of the story, and they're, in his mind, they are made better by the fact that they come out from this huge extra world, not the other way around. Most writers that we have, fantasy writers, write a story and then the world expands out from that story. Even great writers like George R.R. Martin, who I obviously love, he wrote his stories and then the world expanded out from that story. For Tolkien, it was completely the other way. Decades of creating this world, and at the end, just a couple of little stories coming out at the top of it. So that is where his perfectionism came in. He created just these 2 leaves, to use that analogy one more time, but after he finished The Lord of the Rings, he didn't go back and do huge rewrites of it. He went back, yes, he tweaked and things like that, but the main thing he did was go back to the Silmarillion, what we call the Silmarillion, and he kept on changing that, and even up to almost his deathbed, he was changing details of his world. So that's the way I would view this, that where his perfectionism came. It allowed him to have a couple of small moments of absolute detail and clarity and beauty, and then the wider picture, yes, it was amazing and majestic, but he never completed it. We talk often about the languages that he created. Most of the languages he created he created the structure of them. He created the linguistic rules. He was obviously a philologist, so this was all meat and gravy to him. He loved this kind of stuff, but he created the building blocks for the language and a few key words and things like that. The Black speech, for example, the only real bits of Black speech we get are the ring verse. Underneath that is this huge amount of understanding and creation of a structure and what that might mean and where it comes from and how that embodies the character of the land and things like that. But actually all we got out of the top were just a few lines, because he could never complete it all, because he was creating an entire universe. So that's the perfectionist thing. And there was I'm going off on one there. Yeah, apologies. I was at a lecture, Tolkien lecture, about a year ago, actually, with Dr. Demetra. I've forgotten her name. Apologies. She's from the University of Glasgow, but she'd been going through huge amounts of Tolkien's interviews and articles which were done about him during his lifetime, and she was picking up some things that perhaps we hadn't known about him before, and one of the things which came out was the way that he was giving this interview, and he then mentioned a word in Quenya or something like that, and then he started conjugating the verb, and he changed his mind. Having halfway through it, he suddenly changed his mind. Actually, no, the past tense of that word must be da da da, and he was literally changing the language mid-interview. And apparently, this wasn't just a one-off. He would quite regularly do this. He would be talking about something to someone, and he would change his mind about his creation mid-sentence quite regularly. So that's what it was, and he viewed that as being the creative process that went throughout his life. And the big question is, did he consider this just to be his creative process, to be shifting and changing within his own lifetime? Was he opening this up to other people to be doing that after his lifetime? I don't think we ever got a final answer to that one. Let's go to, I'm sure I've missed a few questions in the chat while all this is going on. Let's go to a question from Paul Siegel saying, I read that Tolkien wrote religious themes into Lord of the Rings unconsciously initially, but consciously in the revisions. Do you know any specifics about this? Well, there, in terms of sort of unconsciously, he talks about a few things. So, for example, the Fellowship sets out on Christmas Day. It's December the 25th. He doesn't say it's Christmas Day, but he thinks that's he noted in one of his letters that was propitious, that was reflective of his more spiritual understanding of what this might mean. Also, Lembas, he said that this is one of the more obvious in his mind, one of the more obvious moments when his own Catholic worldview kind of spilled over into his creation. In terms of later work, he became increasingly, if you go to his letters, which I would, if you're a Tolkien fan, if you love this kind of stuff, I highly recommend. Humphrey Carpenter pulled together his letters into a fantastic book, and it gives you a real understanding of not just Tolkien and his work, but the way that he approached it as much as anything else. So you see through that he became increasingly in later life concerned about how his Catholic peers might view his sub-creation and view it, perhaps, I don't think he actually used the word, but view it as slightly heretical. His idea of sub-creation, it wasn't just him, Lewis as well, though, that whole gang, the Inklings, had this concept of sub-creation as created beings getting some, we have this inner need to create ourselves, and that comes across not just in having babies, but also creating works of art, creating videos like I am now. Everybody has within them some kind of creative drive, and so his vision was sub-creation, as he called it, creating his own world. So increasingly, as he got older, he was starting to get a bit more concerned about how his Catholic peers might view that as I say, he didn't use the word heresy, but that's the feel. Not and mixing my metaphors quite badly here, but not kosher is probably how we would say it in a colloquial sense. Reflective rambling, picking up a question. Thank you. I love it when people pick up questions for others. From Dunmar Havoc, saying, if Morgul blades turned people into wraiths, why weren't there more around? And if they did, were they just not seen? Well, it's a good question. So we don't know much about Morgul blades. We don't know how they were created, how easily they were created. The thing is that they seemed, as far as we could tell, certainly the one that was used on Frodo, it was a one-shot deal. So my take is that there weren't bazillions of Morgul blades around. Where might these wraiths be? Well, we do have one big example of where there are wraiths, which is in the Barrow Downs. Now, this wasn't in the films, it was in the books. And this was basically, we get part of the story of the Northern Kingdom of Arnor is that the Witch King of Angmar, over centuries, slowly beat down the Kingdom of Arnor. It split into three, and then there was plagues. He invaded. There was fighting between, or arguments between the different parts of the kingdom, and eventually he managed to wipe it all out. But one of the last stands was in the Barrow Downs, and the Barrow Downs were barrows, burial sites for the people, the kings, the leaders of the people of Arnor, and which is incidentally why the hobbits found these the swords, the daggers that eventually ended the Witch King's life, because they were being used to fight against the Witch King. But because the Witch King knew that the Barrow Downs were being used as this kind of last, or one of the last bases, then he sent wraiths down there, Barrow Wights down there, to be roving that land. And that is who we find getting or capturing Frodo and the hobbits. So There is, and how they got turned that way, perhaps with Morgul blades, where we're not told all of the detail of their history, but there are some there. We also, I mean, there are quite a lot of these kind of ghostly figures in Tolkien. We also obviously, pardon me, get the dead men of Dunharrow. That wasn't Morgul blades who led them there, but this is ghosts, things which are existing on the ethereal, ghostly plane rather than the corporeal plane is actually quite a theme with Tolkien. Chaos Ballerina, picking up a question for Omni Given. Do wizards sleep? Yes, I think is the short answer, but they don't need it as much. They do grow weary, though. For T-Mac, could the Entwives be the ones who woke the trees in the forest near the Shire? So where the Entwives are, or were, very probably is, and this comes from Tolkien, again, this is in one of his letters, this comes from Tolkien, is that he thinks very probably they were in an area just outside Mordor. And they got destroyed when Sauron was doing a Parched Earth retreat strategy during the Second Age. So they were that side rather than going up to the Shire. Now, there are rumours of trees that can move near the Shire. Perhaps they are there, but they were never more than rumours. This was just like stuff that Gaffer Gamgee was talking about down the pub as much as anything else. I think I've got more questions in the chat. Let's just having a quick flick through. Or maybe I'm all caught up. Okay, let's go with a question from 444 saying, as Warner Brothers are willing to film more stories from Middle-earth, what do you think could be adapted? And what do you want to be adapted? Do you think there will be any other Middle-earth series from Prime Video except The Rings of Power? Okay, so in terms of the Prime Video, then when they bought the rights, and the rights, I will say it again, nobody understands where the rights are in Tolkien. If somebody tells you that they understand exactly where the rights are, then they don't. It's incredibly complicated, exactly who owns the rights to do what. But it seems clear that Amazon thought when they bought the rights to be making TV shows based upon what they bought, which was The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, including the appendices, and that's in plural. They've gone with one. They've gone with The Rings of Power. I've not heard anything. I've not heard any rumors. If anyone else has, I'd love to hear it. But I've not heard any rumors for a long time that they're thinking of doing more than that. So I suspected at the time that they were going to see how big a success The Rings of Power was. I suspect that after season one, it's, trying to get inside the mind of someone like Jeff Bezos is probably a doomed mission. But I suspect the feeling within Prime Video is that they hit the mark that they were aiming for in terms of viewers, engagement, things like that. I don't think it exceeded their expectations, but I think also they won't have viewed it as a failure. It was undoubtedly a big hit. Despite there being quite a lot of negative publicity against it, lots of people did watch it, and lots of people continued to watch it. I was paying quite a lot of attention to, as you can understand, to viewing numbers during that period for both that and House of the Dragon. And it was a big hit, and it brought lots of people to Amazon Prime. So I think they were happy with it this wasn't the biggest. This wasn't Game of Thrones season 7 and 8 kind of massive, everybody's talking about it kind of hit, but it was still a big hit. So I think they're probably still holding fire on the idea of, do they want to do a spin-off from it? Do they want to do something completely separate? It's one of the options there, but I've not heard anything. As for the Warner Brothers thing, Warner Brothers, through New Line Cinema, I believe, still have the rights to be making films in the world, in Tolkien's world. Exactly which bits of rights they have, as I say, that's a bit of a mystery. But the president, I think, of Warner Brothers did a little speech about a month ago saying, and I paraphrase, but why is it that it's been 20 years since, without Lord of the Rings films, conveniently forgetting the Hobbit movies, of course, why is it that it's been 20 years since the Harry Potter films, 10 years since the Harry Potter films, conveniently forgetting the Fantastic Beasts films, of course. These are the kinds of things we should be doing. The big intellectual properties, the things that people will definitely want to go and watch, the blockbusters. That's where I am focusing the attention of my organization. I paraphrase, but that was what the gist of it is. So we should expect more films. Now, that going from the head of an organization saying, I would like films about this, to there actually being a film in front of us will be a matter of years. But there is one, The War of the Rohirrim, which is in production. We're expecting it in 2024, I believe. So that is animated. It's got Philippa Boyens is involved, who is involved in the Peter Jackson films. Was in fact involved. She was doing a lot of the writing there. So if you enjoyed the scripts there, then this is good news for that. So that is going to happen. What else might happen? And what else would I like to happen? Well, Tolkien, as we've already said, he only wrote the 2 full stories. We've got a lot of other half stories and or slightly less developed stories or shorter stories. What I would personally think would be great is some of the First Age stuff. We have 3 massive stories in the First Age, which Tolkien did various versions of. We've got Beren and Luthien, The Fall of Gondolin, and The Children of Húrin. I would love, particularly The Children of Húrin, to be adapted. We've got that as close to a full and complete story, and I think that would work wonderfully well. I think Beren and Luthien as well would work exceptionally well as a story. One other thing personally I would love is, and I think that as some sort of anime now, and anime doesn't have to, I mean, I think if you said that 10 years ago, then it would be like, oh, anime is a bit, maybe it might be a bit cheesy, maybe it might not be great quality. Some of the stuff coming out now is really good. I would love to see the creation of Middle Earth, the first bit, before we get to the First Age, the early mythical stories in Tolkien's Legendarium. I would love to see that animated and just given as long as it needs. If you can do that in a 1 or 2 hour thing, great, do that in a 1 or 2 hour thing, but just almost as a kind of a documentary voiceover. I mean, imagine Morgan Freeman doing a voiceover to the visuals of the Song of the Aina and things like that. That would be, I'm not saying it has to be Morgan Freeman, but you get the idea. That's the kind of feel I think would work really well. And the other thing, and I probably won't make many friends for saying this, the other thing I think would probably work would be something like young Aragorn. Now, I know, as I said, I won't get many friends for this because this is held up by a lot of people. This was the idea that Amazon rejected. And I can understand why people are nervous about this, because just saying young Aragorn conjures up these images. Those of us who've ever read or watched things like young Indiana Jones or young James Bond or young Sherlock or whatever it is, they're based on nothing. They're attempts at sort of origin stories. But we do have a story from Tolkien about what Aragorn was doing before the Lord of the Rings. And I think that it's possible to pitch together a story about setting off from Rivendell, about his journeys down to Rohan, what he was up to in Gondor, the relationship there with Denethor, the hunt for Gollum. All of this, I think, you could turn into a really good series if you get it right, and not try and pitch it as young Aragorn, but actually just almost a sort of a prequel to the Lord of the Rings. You could end it at the point when, he's hiding behind a hedge waiting for the hobbits, perhaps. That you could take it all the way up to the very beginning there. So there's a lot there that they could do. Martin S. saying, about Tolkien's perfectionism, you mention, I do consider him to be the best fantasy writer overall. I like a fair few others a lot. Tad Williams, Robert Jordan, George R. Martin seems great too. I still see J.R.R. Tolkien as the highest quality. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't think I can add too much. I'm a huge fan. I mean, Tad Williams is not mentioned enough, I think, for in terms of great fantasy. I think he's definitely excellent. And Robert Jordan, yeah, obviously, and George R. Martin, we know I'm a big fan of. But it's hard to argue against J.R.R. Tolkien, because I don't think anyone will ever do again what he did, which was dedicate decades and decades of his life to the creation of one thing, leading to just a couple of perfect stories coming out at the end. And so that is very different to, say, George R. R. Martin, who I adore, but George R. R. Martin has done it the other way around. Martin S. saying, which society in Tolkien's Legendarium makes the highest quality wine? Okay, Valinor, probably. But in Middle-earth, some elven realm? Oh, it's interesting. So, wine, I think they drank it on Numenor, and I have a feeling that the Numenorian wine would have been very fine. We also get a reference. So Thranduil, the Elven King in Mirkwood, they couldn't really grow wine where they were. It was a forest. They live in a cave. Neither forests nor caves are great for vineyards. So he imported it from, and it escapes my brain exactly where it was, but from some men down to the southeast, and that was good wine. So men did certainly know how to grow wine. But I think my answer is Numenor, and then the Numenorian technology would have been brought across down to Gondor, was probably a better place for sort of vineyards than Arnor up in the north. That's much more sort of a beer kind of place. But yeah, so that's my take. I think Numenor would be where I would go with that. Let's have a question from, I always pause for just a moment during my live streams just to say thank you. First of all, patrons, thank you. This is why I prioritize your questions over everybody else's, because I cannot do what I do without your support. Thank you so much. I hugely appreciate it. If you would like to support this channel, the best way to do that is through Patreon. There is a link down in the description, and also a big thank you to my moderators who do amazing work. If you are watching this live, if you're in the chat, please just show a little bit of love for the moderators. They do excellent stuff. Let's go to a question from Morally, saying in the Silmarillion, we read about the years of the lamps, the years of the trees, and the years of the suns. When did all this happen? I'm just a bit confused about the timeline and would love some clarification. Yeah, so I'm very happy to do this. The high level, very high level history of Middle Earth. There's a bit of time before all of this, or outside of time even, when you get the creation of Middle Earth, or Arda, which is the planet, and then we get some of the Ainur come down and to tend it, basically. Lots of battles with Morgoth, Melkor as he was at the time, but then eventually we get this period when the Valar have Arda to themselves, and this becomes the Years of the Lamps. And it's called the Years of the Lamps because Arda was very different. It was a flat disc at the time. They built these two huge pillars, basically mountains. At the top of those two mountains, they built lamps. That was what was providing the light, and they used this to be cultivating, to be growing the world, to be preparing it for the children of Ilúvatar who would be arriving later. Now, this is all mythological times, basically. So all of this is the way that Tolkien writes it is in a very mythological way. But this is the Years of the Lamps. Then Melkor Morgoth returns, and he has a cunning plan. His cunning plan is to smash the lamps and get rid of the light, and the lamps smash down on the ground, and all of the light and the lamp oil effectively goes over the land, and it corrupts it, and he's had his nefarious ways, and the Valar basically retreat. They create a new continent for themselves, Valinor, over on the west. They build up this huge wall, mountain wall, and to protect themselves. And they put most of the land, the bit which Melkor had kind of ruined, into this sort of hibernation. They get some plants there that are just ready. At some point, they know that the elves and then the humans are going to be arriving, but they do not know when. But they still need light, and so they go, okay, we tried the lamps thing, we'll have trees this time in Valinor, which is where they are, and they create the two trees. We know the two trees of Valinor, one gold and one silver, and they kind of alternated in light, so you'd have the gold at maximum light, while the silver was dimmed and down and low, and then they would sort of shift over. And this light was hallowed. This was good and holy and pure light. And this is the start of the Years of the Trees. Partway through this, the elves appear. Another battle with Melkor Morgoth. He gets defeated, put down in chains for a while. The elves, some of them at least, come over to Valinor, and we have the Years of the Trees, this kind of blissful existence. There's no Morgoth around. The elves are happily living in Valinor. All is well. Morgoth, however, is released, pretends to be repentant, but then, cunning plan number 2, I'm going to destroy the trees this time. Again, he hates the light, and he enlists Ungoliant, the horrible spider-like creature that creates unlight, not darkness, but unlight, and he strikes the trees. Ungoliant drinks the power from them effectively, and the lights go out in Valinor, thus ending the Years of the Trees. He heads off to Middle-earth. A lot of the elves sort of go after him. This is where Feanor's rebellion happens at this same point in time. And the Valar are there going, well, what are we doing now? We need light. The stars were out there. They'd been there during all this time. but they decide, okay, let's do the sun and the moon. And so they're creating the years of the sun. So everything from that point onwards, what we think of as the first, second, third, and fourth age, these are all in the years of the sun. So 3 big blocks of time: the years of the lamps, the years of the trees, and the years of the sun. So that's the high level history of Middle Earth in terms of not just the ages, but the sort of the epochs above that. DM Collins in the chat saying young Aragorn hanging out with young Denethor, but then Aragorn not aging along with him is a huge part of their dynamic that would be great to see. Yeah, absolutely. The Nerd Far Away saying, Robert, did you like the Other Land series? Yeah, this is Tad Williams. I did. I read that a very long time ago. But yes, I did very much. I thought that was excellent. Quick flick through. Question from Caius Ballerina saying, does Meteor Man, this is a Rings of Power question, does Meteor Man not being hot going to have lore significance, or was that just an attempt to trick us into thinking he was Sauron? So, yeah, I struggled with this. So for those who do not remember, I came out with a theory after about week 3 of the Rings of Power that Meteor Man, the stranger, was a Balrog, because all of the hints, and I stand by this, at that time all of the hints were that this is a Maya, that this is evil, and that this is connected with fire. From about week 4 onwards, the evil and fire symbolism got completely switched around to other things. Now, I am sort of holding on to, I heard a rumor the other day about a writing change that happened during the process, which I'm trying to get confirmed, but so I won't spoil it here and now, just in case. But is this an attempt to make us think that that was Sauron? On one level, definitely, because what the biggest mystery of the entire season 1 is, who is Sauron? They're always wanting us to be wondering who is Sauron. Could it be Adar? Could it be the stranger? Oh, surprise, it's, spoiler alert, Halbrand. So that's yes, on one level they were wanting us to think that this really could be Sauron, but it's cool. The fire is cool. Just, I don't know, that bit still kind of rankles with me, because that was a deliberate attempt to make us think that the meteor and Meteor Man was evil. Was it going to have is it going to have a lore significance, perhaps an in-show lore significance? They may sort of retrofit that, but basically, yes, this was an attempt to make us think that it's possible that that was Sauron. Caitlin Lawrence, thank you very much for those kind words in the chat. Malan Buddy saying, random reminder, you're all awesome. I absolutely support that whatsoever. Andrew K saying, push the merch, 'tis the season after all. Well, okay, thank you. I always forget to push the merch. Thank you, Andrew, for reminding me. Down there, probably somewhere, is a little, I hope, if everything's working, possibly is a little link to my merch. If you would like in Deep Geek themed hoodies, other random things, Santa hats, we've got them going on, teddy bears. I mean, the world's your oyster. It's great stuff. I'm terrible at pushing merch, but if you'd like that kind of thing, do go and check that out. Thank you so much for the reminder, Andrew. Let's go to a question from 444 saying this last year most big fantasy series were plagued by a prominent main cast member leaving the series. Henry Cavill won't be playing Geralt anymore, Anna won't be portrayed by Joseph Mawle, and Barney Harris left the Wheel of Time after just 6 episodes. This reminded me of Michael Pride leaving the cast of Robin of Sherwood. We do not know the exact reasons for all these moves, but are fantasy series more exposed for creative differences than non-fantasy series? Okay, so just first on the tangent, for those who don't know, who Michael Pride leading the cast of Robin of Sherwood. Robin of Sherwood was, I think it was BBC, it was definitely a British production back in the 80s of Robin Hood. And for my money, as a TV adaptation, it's the best Robin Hood TV adaptation. It is very 80s. I watched an episode again recently. It is very 80s, but it's great fun. It's it goes through a lot of the classic stories, but it's really well acted. It's written well, and it has this kind of extra layer of kind of mysticism and magic, which is not central to everything, but it's always just kind of lingering, and it works really well. And they had, I think, 3, maybe 4 seasons, the first 2 of which the main character Robin Hood was played by a guy called Michael Pride, and then he left and was replaced by a guy called Jason Connery. Yes, Sean Connery's son. And they handled that really well, actually, in the show, because the Robin Hood mythos has a couple more, in fact, of sort of origin stories for who Robin Hood is. Is he the Robert of Locksley, a lord who is kind of disenfranchised, or is he Robin of the Hood? Is he this more working class hero? And so they just swapped in and out these 2 different, kept the same character, but in world said this person is now taking on the guise of Robin Hood. So they handle it anyway. Anyway, that's a digression. Watch Robin of Sherwood, it's great. In terms of the 3 things you mentioned there, Barney Harris leaving Wheel of Time, I do not know the reason for that. They have, both the actor and the show have been very tight-lipped about it, so I'm not going to speculate on why that is. There's obviously a reason for why everyone's being tight-lipped about it. Yeah, I'm not going to speculate on that. In the Joseph Mawle, this was not a matter of sort of fantasy creative differences, but acting creative differences, as I understand it. Not saying that he wasn't doing the right acting job, but his acting methodology. Henry Cavill, of course, is the interesting one, because he's not given, ostensibly, he's not given a reason for why he left, but all of the indicators are a creative difference with the writing team over how closely it should be adhering to the original stories. Now, are fantasy shows more likely to have that kind of shift? Well, I think people leave TV shows in every genre. I don't think that is in and of itself a particular problem for fantasy shows. I don't think that I can't think off the top of my head of another example of somebody leaving a TV show because they weren't happy with the adaptation of the source material. And it's quite rare that you get somebody who is as wedded to the source material as Henry Cavill was with the Witcher stories. So, yes, potentially, but I don't think it's enough yet for me to say that this is a widespread problem for fantasy shows generally. Martin S. Question saying, do you believe Tanaquetil is inspired by Mount Olympus? Also, do you believe the name Lannister is inspired by the name Lancaster? Tanaquetil inspired by Mount Olympus? Possibly. I've not seen any specific references to that, but it kind of it kind of makes sense. I was just searching my brain to see whether I can remember. I think Tolkien's actually specifically saying that, but he was very obviously inspired by mythologies. Greek perhaps slightly less than Norse and other things like that, but yeah, it makes sense even if it wasn't explicit. Do I believe that the name Lannister is inspired by the name Lancaster? 100%. George R. R. Martin has basically said as much. For those who don't know, the War of the Roses was a succession crisis in England back in the day, and this was fought between the houses of Lancaster and York. And George R. R. Martin said this was one of his big inspirations for Game of Thrones, and it's easy to see Lancaster and York, Lannister and Stark. It works quite easily. So yes, that is definitely the case. Emma Scheiman saying, I'm still so confused about the priestesses. The priestesses following the stranger in Rings of Power. What order did they belong to? Were they just there as a misdirect? Do you have a theory? Well, I think they've been left deliberately vague because this is hopefully something they're going to be revealing in season 2. Because as it stands, the stranger's plot line is completely outside the rest of the story. All the other bits of the story tied together in some way. What was going on with Galadriel and Hellbrand tied in with the Southlands, that looped all the way back around to what was going on with Celebrimbor, which connected in with Gil-galad, and Elrond, which connected back all the way around to Galadriel. So that was like a big, lovely loop of plot that all worked together. The stranger landed away from this story. They headed off towards Mordor, but then turned around and went straight back again. So there's no connection at the moment. There has to be some connection with the main story somewhere, somehow. And they're currently going away from the main story. They're heading east to Rhûn. So the what we're supposed to think is that this is some kind of Sauron cult. This is the way they presented it, was that this is some kind of Sauron cult over in the east. They're waiting for the return of Sauron, and then they saw the meteor and they went hunting for it, thinking that this was the return of Sauron because meteors, magic comes from above, etc., etc., etc. All of the fire imagery, the kind of the evil imagery that we picked up on in the first 2 or 3 episodes, they will have picked up on it as well. And then they got there and realized this isn't Sauron. So that's what they're telling us as a story, which okay, that works, but we now need to know a little bit more. Is there a huge, is all of the east, is Rhûn completely run by people who are waiting for Sauron to return? Is Sauron himself going to go there to kind of gather these people in support of him? It's not at all clear yet. So what order they belong to, not one that Tolkien told us about. Were they just there as a misdirect? Well, certainly part of this could be Sauron kind of idea. They thought he was Sauron. We as viewers should perhaps have been thinking that he was Sauron. But Sauron himself did, he set himself up as this king of men and almost godlike figure. So it kind of does sort of fit and make sense that there is a cult or religious order who are looking out for the return of Sauron, but we haven't got any more information on it. Just having a quick flick through. Reflective Rambling, picking up from William Crescendi. Crescenzi. What do you think about Lord of the Rings Online? I'll be honest, I've never actually played it. I've heard only good things, but I haven't played it. Sorry. To tell me I should play it. Maybe one day I will. But yeah, that's. I don't think I can add anything more to that one. Mara Lee saying, in A Song of Ice and Fire and House of the Dragon, we read about prophecies, one of being about Azor Ahai, the prince that was promised. Did Tolkien write about anything similar in his legendarium? Could Aragorn be called the king who was promised in the books? You have mentioned Jon Snow is sometimes compared to Aragorn, but he's actually more like Frodo. Please elaborate why you think this is so. So, yeah, this is something it's sort of my pithy take, if you've not heard it before. George R. R. Martin is writing Jon Snow as if he's Aragorn, but in reality, he's more like Frodo. So that's my sort of pithy take on it. And this is because, yes, there are prophecies in Tolkien's world, lots of bits of prophecy. Now, there was prophecy for Aragorn's mum had a prophecy about him. Elrond effectively prophesies over him. There's a prophecy about the hands of the king are the hands of the healer that Aragorn fulfills in Minas Tirith. Elrond sends his sons to follow Aragorn and basically say, hey, don't forget about this prophecy about the king going through the paths of the dead, which is what prompts Aragorn to be going through the paths of the dead and getting the dead men of Dunharrow on his side. There are lots of bits of prophecy about swirling around Aragorn as a character. So George R. R. Martin, however, uses prophecy in a different way to Tolkien. In Tolkien, prophecies, if pardon me, if they're good prophecies, then and they come from Uru Ilúvatar or the Valar, then this is just the truth of what's going to happen. You can trust it, basically. Elrond told Aragorn about the prophecy of the paths of the dead because that's where he was supposed to go. With George R. R. Martin, prophecies are a lot more tricksy. They're sometimes right, sometimes very right, but also at the moment you start believing them, then you can get things very wrong. And if you misinterpret them, if you're trying to chase prophecy, that's when things can go particularly wrong. Now, why am I saying about he's writing Jon Snow like Aragorn, but really he's like Frodo? Because he's writing him as this great king in waiting, he's this great leader. The characters are actually quite similar. Jon is quite mopey, actually. He's not got the best sense of humor out of all the characters. He's very serious. He feels the weight of the world on his shoulders a bit. He's a great sword fighter. He's also a natural leader of men. And he comes across as a bit like Aragorn. And Aragorn, obviously, he ends up becoming king, fulfilling all these prophecies. We're going to discover potentially that these prophecies in A Song of Ice and Fire are potentially about Jon. Certainly some people think they are about Jon. Bloodraven definitely does. The prince that was promised, Azor Ahai reborn. This is trying to make him into this great king, focus of prophecy. However, where I think he's going to end up, not just because this is where the show went, but I think that this is where his arc seems to be leading, is to a really sad place, where I think that he will end up having to turn his back on Westeros because he has had to bear so much pain. He has saved the world, but it is not saved for him in the way that Frodo saved the world, but it was not saved for him. and eventually the Frodo sails off because he's wearied of the world and he just needs effectively a new start in Valinor. And John, I think, is going to head north of the Wall because he just needs to leave Westeros. It's just been, he's saved the world, but not for him. And I will actually, as I'm feeling in the mood for a digression, at that final scene, I am convinced that on the basis of a conversation I had with Bookshelf Stud, who's a great guy within the Song of Ice and Fire community, who's been looking at these things for a very long time. He, when he was on this channel, I don't know when it was, 2-3 years ago, he said that he was looking back through an old interview with the guy who did the graphic novel for A Game of Thrones, and he said that this person was asked, did George R. R. Martin give you any feedback on this obvious question? And he basically said no, except for, and I won't say what this is, but there's one scene that he asked me to add in, which I hadn't, because obviously to turn a massive novel into a graphic novel, you've got to condense it hugely down. So he cut quite a lot of stuff out. And so he said George R. R. Martin had asked me to add in this scene because what was said in that scene was going to be important for the final scene of the entire series, which is pretty massive. So Bookshelf Stud went, he said, so I went through the graphic novel and I was looking at it and I was trying to work out which scene is there here that could possibly be the thing that he added back in, because George R. R. Martin wanted him to add in this final scene. And he said he came to the conclusion there was one scene which, if you were to condense a story down, you would not have that scene in it. The only scene that he could see that which could possibly be this about is one where Benjen and John are at that feast. If you remember when Robert Baratheon comes up with all the entourage up to Winterfell, they're at that feast. And then they have a bit of a conversation about Ghost, as it happens. And John's saying, that Ghost is silent, that Ghost doesn't call out. And then Benjen says, you can hear north of the Wall, you can hear the direwolves howling. And the conclusion Bookshelf Stud reached was that this was important because the last scene, the novels, will be John going north of the Wall and hearing the direwolves calling. And that just makes a huge amount of sense. And I think we recorded this before. In fact, I know we recorded this before we knew what that last scene was in the TV show. And it just kind of like reiterated or made me think back to that conversation. I thought, yeah, that actually makes sense. It makes sense of his echo of the Frodo journey, and also where he as a person would wish to end up. So that's my take. I can't even remember how I got to there why he's more like Frodo than Aragorn, because he saves the world but not for himself. Martin S. Would Aula be able to transmute other metals into mithril? Also, how much greater than Narsil would the greatest sword Aula could forge be? Okay, so Aula, for those who do not know, he's one of the Valar. He's the smith. So he's if you think of sort of the Gandalf, Sauron level of powerful, he's the next one up from that. And he is the smith. He's basically the person who all of the great smiths of this world learned their stuff from. Sauron learned his stuff from him. Fëanor learned his stuff from him. So this is where the great smiths learned from. And Aula was this great creator. He created the dwarfs. That's how amazing he was at creating things. He created the dwarfs. So could he create something transmute other metals into mithril. Well, we're not told the exact limits of his powers, but I think the sort of the implication is that the Valar are they can't create something from nothing. They have to be creating using what they've got around them. It's only Iluvatar himself who can create something from nothing. So could they transmute something? Could he transmute something into mithril? I guess so. But we're just never really told of that. And could he create a sword which is greater than Narsil? Well, yeah, absolutely he could. Narsil is powerful and amazing, but it's fundamentally flawed. It shattered. So could he create something which is better than that? I suspect if you gave him mithril and a little bit of time, he would fashion something which would not shatter and would have huge amounts of magical powers. So yes, he definitely could. I've got one more question from one of my patrons, but I'll try and pick up as many questions as I can in the chat. Mara Lee, this is my last question from one of my patrons, and then I will go and pick up things in the chat. So what happened to the Rings of Power after the One Ring was finally destroyed and Sauron was finally defeated? What was the eventual fate of the Ringwraiths and the dwarves that wore those rings? Did the Ringwraiths just fade away? What happened to the dwarves? We saw Gandalf, Galadriel, Elrond sail away with Frodo, but not sure what happened to the other ring bearers. Okay, so this is again, this is something that maybe I'll do a video on at some point. But what happened to the Rings of Power? So we've got 9, 7, 3, and 1. So we've got 20 in total. The One Ring, we know the One Ring got destroyed. The 3 Elven Rings, we know they were worn by Galadriel, Elrond, and Gandalf, and they were wearing them when they set off sailing west. So that's what's happened to them. The 9, the ones that the Ringwraiths had, Tolkien gave us 2 different versions of where exactly they were. One of them, the Ringwraiths still had them, and one of them, Sauron had, once they'd turned wraith-like, he then sort of gathered them together and kept them in Mordor. In either event, when the One Ring was destroyed, their power was ended, and the wraiths were freed effectively, and so they headed off. So the ring was no longer binding them. If the rings were with them, physically with them, then they all flew off to towards Mount Doom, just because the moment that Frodo put on that ring, they were flying, and then they turned around and headed back. But the body of obviously the Witch King was killed, the Witch King was killed earlier in the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. But probably my best instinct is that Sauron had collected them all together and had them with him in the Dark Tower. So when the Dark Tower collapsed and were destroyed, they got buried. So that's almost certainly what happened to them, which just leaves the 7 dwarf rings. Now, we know 4 of those were destroyed by dragonfire, because basically what happened was that the dwarf lords, they wore these rings, and the rings, they were resistant to the power control by Sauron, but it did make them dig deep and amass these what were called the 7 dwarf hoards, these great hoards of jewels and gems and gold and other treasures, and that attracted the dragons. And so the dragons attacked horde after horde. 4 of them, the rings were destroyed. The implication is that the ring was worn, held by the Dwarf King, and the Dwarf King got burned by one of the dragons. So 4 are gone, which leaves 3. Sauron then basically hunted down those 3 rings. One of them we do know about. If you remember, we get actually we saw it in the Hobbit movie when we find Thrain there, who is captured by Sauron, and Gandalf finds him in Dol Guldur, and the ring, he had the dwarf ring, and Sauron stole it from him. So what happened to those 3 rings? Well, Sauron had them. They actually got offered back to the dwarves. He sent, just before the War of the Ring, he sent an emissary to Erebor, to the Lonely Mountain, and said, basically, if you help us out, if you help us find where the one ring is, then you can have these shiny rings back. Now, Sauron sent there because he was hunting for the ring, and he got from Gollum this idea that, Bilbo went over to the Lonely Mountain, and then he worked his way back home again afterwards, so Sauron was trying to hunt them down. The dwarves said no. This is why Gimli was at the Council of Elrond, to say, we had this really shifty-looking messenger come to us, offer us some powerful rings in exchange for a bit of information. I thought we should let you know. But those 3 dwarf rings almost certainly were being held by Sauron. So again, best guess is that those 3 rings were destroyed when the Dark Tower fell. They will have lost their power in any event. So 20 rings. The 3 elven rings, they're still pretty, but they have lost their power, have headed over to Valinor. The others are all destroyed. So with the end of the one ring, all of the rings of power are gone. There are none left over. Caius Ballerina picking up a question. Thank you very much. Picking up a question saying, William Crescency asking, what's so special about Narsil? Why must it be reforged? It's heritage, prophecy, symbol of hope, or is there some special quality too? Well, there is a special quality to it. It is a fine sword, but it's more the symbol. And this is one of those things that it was because it was the sword of Elendil that then was taken up by Isildur. This is a symbol of the High King. So for the people of Gondor, this was a symbol that Aragorn came from the line of the High King. It was one of a number of symbols that he had, but it was a big and important symbol. For Sauron, this was one of those important things which you kind of overlook, but I covered this in my The Lord of the Rings from Sauron's perspective video. When Aragorn looks into the Palantir and faces down Sauron, he shows him the sword, and he basically says, you see this sword? You know what this sword is? It's back. I'm back. I'm the heir of Isildur. I've got this sword. And basically said, I'm coming for you. Now, that was important because Sauron suddenly got worried because he had been hunting for the heirs of Isildur all this time. And the Witch King had been hunting for them. And it had all gone very quiet for a very long time. But he was concerned about this. And he then became convinced that Aragorn must have the ring. Why else would he challenge Sauron and then literally march with a minuscule force on Mordor? He must have the ring. And so this was the important moment in keeping Sauron's eye away from Frodo and Sam. Without that, he would have been going, where's the ring? I don't know what's going on. I'm not sure where the ring is right now. The last I heard of it, a hobbit had it. But now suddenly he became convinced that Aragorn had it. And he became convinced that Aragorn was going to try and come for him because he showed him the sword which got him last time. So that's the importance of it. It is yes, it's a great sword, but it's symbolic both for the people and also for Sauron. Reflective rambling, or just saying, we credit a lot of the "I'm not inferring no" to Ulmo, but what about Ossa, Uinen, Salmar, and Uin? Any indication that they share his will to guide those in Middle Earth, act on his behalf or on their own? So these are sort of support lesser. They're not really lesser Valar, but they're sort of Maya supporting the Ulmo. Ulmo, yes, we give him credit. I give him credit. Lots of other people do. He's described as the Valar who never abandoned the children of Iluvatar, even when they were on under the wrath of all the other of the Valar. Now, he did stick around and help out, and he does this a lot, all through the stories. Sometimes obviously, sometimes less than obviously. He literally appears himself at times. Other times we get this kind of whisper of a dream when people are next to the Anduin, when Boromir and Faramir are next to the Anduin, which is water. Ulmo is the Lord of Water. He's more the Lord of the Seas. So might others be involved? Yes, possibly, but the driving force here is Ulmo, definitely, in my view. Question from Reflective Random, picking up for Rugby Mad. Why did Aragorn get lost between Weathertop and Rivendell, given his skill as a tracker and someone who was raised in Rivendell? This is more of a movie thing, really, than a book thing. His aim was to get to Rivendell as quickly as he could. He didn't get lost. In the movie, then we get Aragorn comes and what's this? A ranger caught off his guard. So and he doesn't appear to be knowing exactly where he's going, but in the books he does. Yes, you're right. He's very much somebody who knows that area particularly well. Question from Caius Ballerina saying, I get that the Astari were nerfed so they would be guides, not magical conquerors, and fight Sauron alone without the inhabitants of Middle-earth. But why delete their memories? Can't they give better advice with them? So, pardon me, their memories weren't wiped so much. So this is when they arrive, the memories of Valinor are faded, cloudy. The reason why, I don't think Tolkien explicitly sets this out, but the reason why I think is that if they could remember it fully and clearly, they would just be wanting to go back because it's great. So they would be always pulled back. So it's slightly cloudy to them. But what Tolkien does say is that it dimmed even further to the point of pretty much disappearing for those who lost their focus on their mission. So Saruman, the Blue Wizards, Radagast, they lost that. Gandalf did not. He did remember. He did retain this cloudy vision of Valinor. He did understand some of that. But this is also a matter of we have to accept quite how much in power level above all of the inhabitants of Middle-earth the Maiar are. And the best example of this, I think I've just finished making a video about the history of Khazad-dûm, and that's coming out on Monday, I think. But in that, it just reminded me, Khazad-dûm was the greatest city ever in Middle-earth. Huge, magnificent, many, many dwarves, and powerful dwarves at the height of their power, with access to Mithril, with access to on their home turf. One Balrog managed to defeat them all, managed to push them all out from Khazad-dûm. One Maya managed to defeat the entire dwarven nation of the Longbeards, of Durin's folk. That's how much above the level of normal mortals they are. Gandalf was equal in power to him. If he had the perfect knowledge of absolutely everything, as well as and memories of Valinor, that would just make him too OP, and he wouldn't, even despite himself, people would be following him. And so I think that's my general take. We often underestimate quite how powerful the Maiar are. Let's go into the chat. So let's have a quick flick through. Tony Sled saying Gandalf also had no idea he could take him, and elves have defeated Balrogs before. Elves have defeated Balrogs before. This is one of the things about Tolkien's writing shifting over time, his understanding of his world shifting over time. His understanding of Balrogs did shift over time. So yes, an elf defeating a Balrog in the First Age was hugely impressive. But at the time of writing that, Tolkien wasn't seeing the Balrog as a Maya. It's only later on, when he's writing The Lord of the Rings, that he starts to think about them and saying, how many of these actually might there be? 7, 3? Back when writing the Silmarillion, it's hundreds of them. So yeah, that's he did shift his views on what a Balrog was like. Tony Stead saying, I think the dwarves got blindsided and didn't have the ability to defend themselves from orcs plus a Balrog. The orcs came later. It was the Balrog first, pretty much on its own. Having a quick flick through. River Boa 99 saying, where is Eru Ilúvatar located? Outside of time. Eru Ilúvatar is God, basically. So it's like, where is, and the kind of the Judeo-Christian idea of God, where is God outside of space and time? Persephone saying, I must admit it's been 25 years since I read Tolkien. Go back and read it. Excellent stuff. Andrew K saying, apologies if I missed it, but did you ever do a video breaking down the different types or groups of elves? No, I keep on saying I will, and I will. But no, I've not done that one yet. Reflective Rambling saying, Libby Rosie Waite has a great question above. Okay, I'll see whether I can find that one. Let's go to see whether I can find it. Jude the Fourth saying Willow TV series plotline. I won't say what the plotline is, but do tell me if you've been watching. I've not had a chance to watch Willow. I'm really fascinated to know whether this is going to be good, because I really enjoyed the movie. I say I've not seen the movie for a long time, but I really enjoy it. Still looking for this. Oh, here we go. Libby Rose Waite. What do you think about the theory that the 4 hobbits represent the 4 aspects of personality in Jungian psychology? Thinking, Frodo; intuition, Pippin; sensation, Merry; and feeling, Sam. Wow, great question. I would have to look into that, to be honest. Is the only answer. Do those characters sort of match that? Frodo is a very thinky kind of person. Intuition Pippin, yeah, I can get that. Sensation Merry, I think it's probably one of the weaker ones, but Feeling Sam, yeah, he's very, very feeling and caring. So yeah, I think that could match up. I suspect it's probably not intentional on Tolkien's part, but what he was, because he captured personality traits so very well, then I think it makes sense to me that somebody who's studying personality traits and comes up with his 4 different types, if Tolkien was trying to create a well-rounded group of 4 individuals, it would make sense that those match up to those types. So I come back to one of my favorite phrases, correlation rather than causation. So these things would match up, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's because it was a deliberate echo of that. Right, let's going. So Kazigli Bay saying, bummed that we have to wait until 2024 for the next season of Andor, but it is very rewatchable. Yeah, Andor was excellent. Love Muscle saying Robert removed his glasses but then scratches his head. I didn't realize scratching the head was a thing as well. I know people pay attention to me losing my glasses. Alan Simpson saying the Notion Club papers do refer to Jung at one point, I think, so it's not impossible. Oh, well, I mean, I think Tolkien will have been aware, definitely. The Notion Club papers, for those who don't know, this is an abandoned story, basically, that Tolkien wrote when he was in his early days of working through what he wanted to write. He and C.S. Lewis, I think came up with this idea. They thought, well, we should write the kinds of stories that are out there that we like, but we don't see good ones of them. And so they Lewis went off and wrote a kind of a space travel one, which was the Out of the Silent Planet series, Paralandra, I think it's called, and then which are fun science fiction stories, incidentally. If you only ever read the Narnia books by C.S. Lewis, he did do some other really fun fiction. And Tolkien, obviously being Tolkien, didn't finish any of this, but then he did try and write time travel stories. The Notion Club papers is sort of based on this idea. He kind of abandoned it when he realized that with these time travel stories, he was actually just wanting to get back to write about the civilization of Atlantis. And actually, this whole time travel nonsense was not helping him. He just wanted to write about Atlantis. And that's where Numenor, and his writing about Numenor, started to really develop. The Notion Club papers, incidentally, this is a little bit of Tolkien trivia for you. He called them that because he had this group of academics who called themselves the Notion Club. And this was his little hat tip to his own writing group called the Inklings, because a notion is quite similar to an inkling of something. Yeah, it's fun. Couple of questions. From Jewel Elson, not a question, just a super sticker. Thank you very much for that. Martin S, that's somebody playing a trumpet, I think. Martin S saying, Manwë and Varda live atop Taniquetil. Could it be that Manwë used his air powers to keep the air pressure higher than normal at that height at their palace for comfort? Or do they breathe thin air? Well, this sort of reminds me of, for those who missed the Taniquetil reference when I was talking about it quarter of an hour or so ago. So this is the mountain of the gods, where the gods live. The Valar live in Valinor is Tanaquetil. Manwë lives at the very top, which obviously has the echo from Mount Olympus, but it's I was struggling to remember whether or not he'd ever explicitly said or made that link across to that mythology. So living on the top of Tanaquetil, did Manwë use his air powers to keep the air pressure higher than normal, or do they breathe thin air? So in the same way that Maiar are immortal spiritual beings who can take on and change their physical forms, so are the Valar. They can take on whatever physical forms they want. So I personally suspect that yes, they were incredibly high altitude. They just changed their physical forms, that was okay. He didn't have to change the air around him. He just changed his own physical forms. Reflective, I'm saying, oh, you absolutely scratch. That's when we know you're really stumbled. Glasses off, hair sometimes, a cheek scratch. Well, okay, I did not realize that this is, you learn a lot doing this. This is clearly what I do. Quick flick through. A love muscle saying, bad internet tonight. Thank you, Robert, for your videos. I'll have to rewatch later. You're very welcome. Thank you for that. Zravon, random unrelated question. How many people know that Gandalf was Istari? Did the Fellowship know? Do you have a video on this? No, I don't have a video on that specifically, but it was quite a small number. Círdan obviously knew, and then the I think Galadriel and Elrond, but the general populace, no. This was quite a small secret. They were just wizards to most people. Persephone saying, do you think that the different races equated to the elements? Humans, water, hobbits, earth, elves, wind, orcs, fire, and wizards, spirit. Again, I think you could map it across, but I think for me, no, I don't think that Tolkien went into that kind of trying to map his creation into something else, if that makes sense, saying this equals that. I think he would see that as being slightly too allegorical. And as we know, he cordially disliked allegory in all its guises. I think with that, Effective Randy saying, Círdan, hoping one of the cast releases in particular is him. Yes, they're one of the people, I'm convinced, one of the people in the first set of new castings for the Rings of Power will be Círdan. Círdan is old. He's the oldest elf in Middle-earth. So I forget the actor's name. I have seen him in other things, and he's a good actor, and he is an older guy who was there as one of those new principal actors, and I suspect that's probably him. Yes, one of them is, as for who the other ones are, Na'vi perhaps is going to be another one. It would make sense. I think a lot of the action is going to be focused in and around Eregion. Okay, I think with that, I am going to start bringing this to a close. I hope you enjoyed, by the way. I deliberately positioned this so if you're watching this rather than just listening, I do look like Gandalf in a hat like that. I do enjoy that. Anyway, I will be back with videos coming up very soon. I've got one with a sort of a Targaryen family tree / witch dragons with a riding video coming out at some point very soon. I've got the a video on Khazad-dûm coming out on Monday, and I've got a couple more collaborations with History of Westeros looking at Maegor the Cruel. Was he really that cruel? Who even was he? So those are a few things to be looking forward to. Pardon me. And I'll be back next week with another live stream. I can't remember off the top of my head what I said I was going to be doing, but I think it's going to be a Song of Ice and Fire related. So if you're watching this back a little bit later, there's going to be a link appearing here to some more videos that I have done, some more live streams. A link is going to appear here for Patreon if you wish to support this channel. That's the best way to do it. But thank you so much, patrons, moderators, all the excellent questions today. Take care, everyone, and I will see you again soon.